Iowa, 1944. The cornfields stretched endless under a pale summer sky, rows so straight they seemed to pull the horizon closer. In the distance, a truck rattled down a gravel road, kicking up dust that hung in the air like smoke. Inside sat 12 men in faded gray uniforms, hands calloused, faces burned dark by the African sun. They had crossed an ocean as enemies. Now they were crossing farmland as something else entirely. The farmer waiting at the gate didn't know their names yet, but he knew his crops were dying, and these men were all he had. By the spring of 1944, Iowa faced a crisis that threatened to destroy everything the state had built. The farmland was among the richest in America. Black soil so deep you could sink your arm to the elbow. Corn that grew taller than a man. Wheat fields that rolled like golden oceans when the wind moved through them. But the men who worked those fields were gone. 300,000 Iowa men had shipped overseas. They fought in France, in Italy, in the Pacific Islands where the jungle swallowed soldiers whole. The ones who remained were too old, too young, or too broken to fight. The women worked until their hands bled, but there weren't enough hands. The crops needed harvesting, the livestock needed tending, and the government needed food. The War Food Administration sent telegrams that spring. Urgent, mandatory. Iowa would receive prisoners of war to work the farms. German soldiers captured in North Africa, in Sicily, in the fields of France. Men who had fired on American troops would now pick American corn. The announcement landed like a stone in still water. The train arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in May. The heat was just beginning to settle into the land, turning the air thick and heavy. At Camp Algona in northern Iowa, guards watched as boxcar doors slid open and prisoners stepped onto American soil for the first time. They came blinking into the light, faces lean from months at sea, uniforms bleached by salt water and sun. Some were young, barely 20, with soft faces that hadn't quite hardened into men. Others carried themselves with the rigid bearing of career soldiers, back straight despite exhaustion. Hans Müller was among them, 23 years old, captured outside Tunis when his unit ran out of ammunition and water on the same scorching afternoon. He had expected America to look different, harder, maybe, more industrial. Instead, he saw farmland that reminded him of Bavaria, rolling hills, clusters of trees, a sky that went on forever. The camp itself sat on the edge of town, rows of wooden barracks painted white, surrounded by wire fences that seemed almost apologetic. Guard towers stood at the corners, but the men manning them looked bored rather than vigilant. Beyond the fence, children rode bicycles down Main Street. A woman hung laundry in her backyard. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. This was the enemy homeland. It looked like home. Inside the mess hall, the prisoners sat on long benches while an American officer explained the rules through an interpreter. The Geneva Convention would be honored. They would work but not fight. They would receive fair treatment, adequate food, medical care if needed. In return, they would respect American authority and cause no trouble. Hans barely listened. He was watching the other prisoners, reading faces the way soldiers learned to do. Some looked relieved, others looked suspicious, waiting for the cruelty they'd been promised. The propaganda back home had painted Americans as barbaric, greedy capitalists who would work prisoners to death, who tortured captured soldiers, who cared nothing for human dignity. But the officer's tone was matter-of-fact, almost gentle. And when the meal came, Hans stared at the tray in disbelief. Roast beef, real beef, still warm with gravy that pooled around mashed potatoes. Green beans, fresh bread with butter. Coffee that smelled like actual coffee, not the acorn substitute they'd been drinking for months. Across the table, another prisoner named Otto picked up his fork and set it down again. His hands trembled slightly. They had been eating survival rations for so long that abundance felt dangerous, like a trap. "They're fattening us for something," Otto whispered in German. But Hans was already eating. The meat dissolved on his tongue, and for the first time in 18 months, his stomach didn't cramp with hunger. Around the hall, prisoners ate in silence, each man alone with the same terrible realization. The enemy fed them better than their own army had. The next morning, trucks arrived to disperse prisoners to farms across the region. The process was bureaucratic and strange. Farmers had submitted applications weeks earlier, requesting labor, specifying how many men they needed and what work awaited. The prisoners were matched to farms like spare parts to machines. Hans and 5 others were assigned to the Hartmann farm outside Algona. The name made him smile bitterly. Hartmann, a German name, though the family had been in Iowa for 3 generations. The truck bounced along gravel roads, past fields already green with early corn, past farmhouses with American flags hanging limply in the still air. When they pulled into the drive, a man was waiting, late 50s, maybe 60, face weathered like old leather, shoulders still broad despite his age. He wore work boots caked with dried mud, and a shirt that had seen better decades. Behind him stood a woman, younger, wearing an apron dusted with flour. 2 boys, maybe 12 and 14, watched from the porch steps with wide eyes. The farmer's name was William Hartmann. His grandfather had left Germany in 1870, back when it was still a collection of kingdoms and principalities rather than a unified nation. William spoke English with no trace of accent, but his father had taught him German as a child, and he still remembered enough to stumble through basic sentences. "You'll be staying in the barn loft," he said, gesturing toward a massive red structure that dominated the farmyard. "Beds are up there. Meals with us, 3 times a day. Work starts at dawn, ends at dusk. Sundays you rest unless something's urgent." He paused, studying the prisoners with eyes that revealed nothing. "My boy died at Normandy," he said finally. "James. He was 21. The words hung in the air like smoke. Otto looked at the ground. Hans felt his jaw tighten. One of the younger prisoners, barely 19, seemed to fold into himself. But William just nodded slowly. He understood duty. "I expect you do too. Work hard, 'cause no trouble, and we'll get along fine." He turned and walked toward the house, conversation over. Dawn came early and absolute. Hans woke to light streaming through gaps in the barn wood, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended like stars. The loft smelled of hay and old timber, and somewhere below, cattle shifted in their stalls, lowing softly. Outside, the farm revealed itself in pieces. The house sat solid and square, painted white with green shutters. A chicken coop bustled with morning noise. Gardens sprawled behind a wire fence, rows of vegetables just beginning to push through the soil. Beyond, the field stretched toward the horizon, dark earth waiting for seeds that would transform it into an ocean of corn. William was already in the yard, checking equipment with the methodical patience of a man who'd been doing this for 40 years. He showed them the tools without ceremony, plows and cultivators, seeders that looked like medieval torture devices, tractors that coughed black smoke and rattled like they might fall apart at any moment. "You know farming?" he asked Hans. "My father had land, small, near Munich." William nodded. "Then you know, plants don't care about politics. They need water, sun, attention. You give them that, they'll feed you. You ignore them, everyone starves." They worked in teams that first day, preparing fields for late planting. The work was brutal in its simplicity. Walk behind the plow, keep the rows straight. Don't let the machinery stall. Hans's hands, soft from months of inactivity, blistered within hours. His back screamed. The Iowa sun felt different from the African sun, less violent but more persistent, soaking into everything until sweat poured down his spine in steady rivers. At midday, William's wife, Margaret, brought lunch to the field. Sandwiches made with thick-cut bread and ham, lemonade in glass jars, condensation running down the sides. She set the basket on the tailgate of a truck and walked away without speaking, but the gesture itself spoke volumes. The prisoners ate in the shade of the truck, too exhausted for conversation. Around them, the Iowa landscape breathed softly. Meadowlarks called from fence posts. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals no one could see. In the distance, another farm's windmill turned slowly, pulling water from deep beneath the earth. Hans bit into his sandwich and felt something inside him shift. The bread was fresh. The ham was real. And for just a moment, sitting in the shade with food in his belly and honest work behind him, The war seemed very far away. That first evening, William surprised them. Instead of directing the prisoners to eat separately, he gestured toward the farmhouse. "You'll eat with us," he said. "Can't have Margaret cooking 2 meals." The dining room was modest, a long wooden table, worn smooth by decades of use. Simple chairs, windows that looked out over the fields, now turning gold in the sunset light. The walls held family photographs, faces staring out from sepia tones, generations of Hartmans who had worked this same land. Margaret served chicken, roasted until the skin crackled, mashed potatoes, corn from last year's harvest, gravy made from drippings. The 2 boys, Thomas and Peter, sat silent and wide-eyed, stealing glances at the German soldiers eating across from them. For several minutes, no one spoke. Forks scraped plates. Someone coughed. Outside, cicadas began their evening song, a sound that would become the soundtrack of summer. Finally, young Peter, the 14-year-old, couldn't contain himself any longer. "Did you kill Americans?" he asked, voice cracking slightly. "Peter!" Margaret's face flushed red. But William held up a hand. He looked at Hans, waiting. Hans set down his fork carefully. He had been asked this question before, in the camp, by other prisoners who wanted to brag or confess or both. But this felt different. This boy had lost a brother. This family had paid a price Hans couldn't calculate. "I was a medic," he said in careful English. "I tried to save soldiers, German, American, British, anyone who was bleeding." It wasn't quite true. He had been more than a medic. He had carried a rifle, he had fired it. But in this moment, in this room with these people, that truth felt too heavy to speak aloud. Peter nodded slowly, considering this. "James wanted to be a doctor," he said quietly. "Before." The word hung there. Before the war, before the world split open, before sons became soldiers and soldiers became ghosts. William cleared his throat. "More chicken," he said, passing the platter. And the meal continued, each person alone with their thoughts together at the table. The summer settled over Iowa like a blanket. By mid-June, the corn was knee-high, and the work shifted from planting to cultivation. The prisoners fell into a rhythm, their bodies adapting to the relentless physical demands. Hans's hands developed thick calluses, his shoulders broadened. The gauntness left his face. They learned the language of the farm. Not just English, though, that came too, pieced together from William's patient explanations and Margaret's gentle corrections. But the deeper language, how to read the sky for rain, how to tell when soil had the right moisture, how to judge if a plant was thriving or merely surviving. Otto proved surprisingly adept with machinery. He had been an engineer before the war, and he approached the tractors like puzzles to be solved. When one broke down, he would spend hours in the barn, tools spread around him, muttering in German as he diagnosed and repaired. William watched this with quiet approval. One evening, he brought Otto a manual for a newer tractor model, pages dog-eared and stained with oil. "Thought you might find this interesting," he said, setting it down without ceremony. Otto stared at the book like it was a religious text. That night, Hans saw him reading by lamplight in the loft, lips moving as he translated technical English into understanding. Sundays were complicated. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be allowed to worship, and Camp Algona had arranged for a Lutheran minister to visit. But the local churches had mixed feelings about German soldiers sitting in their pews. The first Sunday, William drove the prisoners into town in the bed of his truck. They wore their gray uniforms, freshly washed but still obviously military. When they arrived at the white clapboard church on Main Street, people stopped on the steps. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman pulled her daughter closer. Inside, the prisoners sat in the back row. The service proceeded normally at first. Hymns that Hans knew from childhood, sung in English but with the same melodies, scripture readings. The minister's sermon about forgiveness and grace, his voice gaining urgency as if he needed to convince himself as much as his congregation. But during communion, an older man stood up. His face was red, veins standing out on his neck. "My grandson is fighting in France," he said, voice shaking, and we're supposed to pray alongside the men trying to kill him? The church fell silent. Hans felt every eye in the room turn toward the back pew. His throat tightened. Part of him wanted to stand to defend himself, to explain that he had never wanted this war, that he was just a man who had been called up and sent to places he'd never heard of to fight for reasons he didn't fully understand. But before he could move, William stood up from his seat 3 rows ahead. "My son died on Omaha Beach," he said quietly. "James." He was 21 years old. The church held its breath. "These men didn't kill him," William continued. "They were in North Africa. They're here because I need help and they need work. And if this church won't show them the same grace God shows us, then I don't know what we're doing here every Sunday." He sat down. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Finally, the minister cleared his throat and continued with the service. Some people received communion. Others left early, the door banging shut behind them. Afterward, in the truck driving home, no one spoke. But when they pulled into the farmyard, William looked back at the prisoners through the rear window. "Don't take it personal," he said. "People are scared and angry. They'll come around or they won't." That night, Hans wrote a letter to his mother that would never be sent. He wrote about a man who had defended him in a church, and how that simple act had cracked something open inside his chest that he'd been keeping sealed for years. July brought heat that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The corn grew taller, stalks reaching toward the sky with an urgency that felt almost desperate. In the fields, the air shimmered and bent, making distant objects waver like mirages. The work intensified: weeding, pest control, irrigation management. The prisoners worked alongside William and his sons, all of them moving through the rows with the same dogged determination. The war became something abstract, a radio broadcast heard in passing, a newspaper headline glimpsed but not read. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled across the prairie. They saw it coming from miles away, a wall of dark clouds advancing like an army. Lightning flickered inside it, illuminating the clouds from within. The air pressure dropped, making ears pop, and then the wind hit. They ran for the barn, all of them together, Americans and Germans moving as one unit. The rain came sideways, soaking them instantly. In the barn they stood catching their breath, watching water pour from the sky in solid sheets. "Needed this," William said, staring out at the fields. "Another week of that heat and we'd lose half the crop." Hans stood beside him, watching rain hammer the roof of the chicken coop. In that moment, he understood something he'd never quite grasped before. The farmer didn't see nationality. He saw hands, help, human effort directed toward a goal that transcended borders and politics and ideology. The plants needed tending. Nothing else mattered. While William treated the prisoners with gruff fairness, Margaret approached them with something softer. She learned their names, their ages, where they came from. She asked about their families with genuine interest, and when they mentioned missing home, she listened without judgment. One evening, she taught them to make apple pie. The youngest prisoner, Klaus, had never baked anything in his life, and he approached the task with the nervous intensity of a man defusing a bomb. Margaret laughed, a warm sound that filled the kitchen, and showed him how to work the dough with gentle hands. "Like this," she said, guiding his hands. "Not too hard, let it come together natural." Klaus's face was a study in concentration. Flour dusted his nose. His tongue stuck out slightly, and when the pie came out of the oven, golden and perfect, he stared at it like he'd created something sacred. "My mother made these," he said softly. "I didn't think I'd taste this again." Margaret cut him a slice while it was still hot, steam rising from the filling. "Everyone deserves pie," she said simply. That night, the prisoners sat on the loft steps watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Klaus ate his slice slowly, making it last, and for the first time since his capture, Hans saw him smile. In late July, the town organized a baseball game. Farmers versus Camp Algona prisoners. It was meant as entertainment, a way to break the monotony of summer, but it carried undertones no one wanted to acknowledge. The field sat on the edge of town, Grass mowed short, bases marked with white paint. Bleachers on one side held townspeople, families who had come to watch their neighbors play. On the other side, prisoners sat in neat rows, guarded but relaxed. Hans had never played baseball. The rules seemed unnecessarily complicated, the logic backwards. But when they needed one more player, Otto volunteered him. "You are track and field," Otto said. "You can run." So Hans found himself in right field, glove borrowed and too large for his hand, trying to understand a game that made no sense. The bat cracked. The ball flew. People shouted instructions he couldn't decipher. He ran when someone waved, stopped when someone yelled, felt utterly lost. But in the seventh inning, something shifted. The ball came toward him, high and lazy, sun behind it. He tracked it the way he'd tracked wounded soldiers in smoke-filled battlefields, judging trajectory and speed by instinct rather than thought. His feet moved. The ball dropped into his glove with a satisfying thunk. The prisoner stands erupted in cheers. The town side groaned. And Hans stood there, glove raised, grinning like an idiot. They lost 8-4, but afterward, townspeople shook hands with prisoners. A farmer named Jensen clapped Otto on the shoulder. "Hell of a play in the fifth," he said. And just like that, they were men who played baseball together. The war didn't disappear, but it receded, just slightly, pushed back by the simple human joy of a game played on a summer evening. By August, the corn stood taller than Hans's head. He walked between rows that created a green cathedral, sunlight filtering through leaves overhead. The tassels were forming. Soon they would begin harvest, and the real work would start. One afternoon, while checking irrigation, Hans found Peter sitting by the creek that ran through the back 40. The boy was crying, trying to hide it, shoulders shaking with the effort of staying quiet. Hans almost walked away. This wasn't his business. These weren't his people. But something made him stop. "You okay?" he asked in halting English. Peter wiped his face roughly. "I'm fine." Hans sat down on the bank a few feet away. The creek moved slowly, brown water sliding over smooth stones. Dragonflies hovered above the surface, iridescent in the afternoon light. They sat in silence for several minutes. "I miss my brother," Peter finally said. His voice was thick. "Everyone acts like we should just move on, like it's been long enough, but I still expect him to come home. I hear the truck and I think it's him." Hans looked at the water. In it he saw other faces. Men he'd served with. Men he'd tried to save and couldn't. The endless parade of the dead that soldiers carry forever. "I had a friend," he said slowly, "in my unit, Friedrich. We grew up together, same town, same school." He paused, searching for English words that could hold the weight of memory. "He died in Tunisia, sand in his lungs. I held him while he drowned in desert air. And for months after, I would turn to tell him something and he wouldn't be there. Every time it surprised me, like I forgot he was gone." Peter looked at him with red eyes. "Does it get better?" Hans thought about this, about truth and kindness, and what you tell a 14-year-old boy sitting by a creek in Iowa. "No," he said finally, "but you get stronger, and the weight gets easier to carry." They sat together as the sun dropped lower, two people from different worlds, bound by the same grief. And when they walked back to the farmhouse together, something had shifted between them that neither could quite name. Harvest season arrived like a wave. The corn had turned from green to gold, stalks dry and rattling in the wind. Every farm in the county mobilized, neighbors helping neighbors in an ancient rhythm that predated nations and wars. The work was brutal. Up before dawn, working until dark, pausing only for meals eaten standing in the fields. The prisoners operated harvesting equipment, loaded wagons, drove trucks to the grain elevators in town. Their hands blistered and healed and blistered again. Their bodies moved on autopilot, muscles remembering tasks faster than minds could process them. Hans ran a combine, the machine loud enough to rattle teeth. Dust filled his lungs. Corn husks scratched his arms bloody. But there was something hypnotic about the work. The endless rows feeding into the machine. the grain pouring into trucks, the visible proof of effort translating into food that would feed soldiers and civilians alike. One evening, after a 14-hour day, William brought beer to the field. Cold bottles, condensation running down the glass like tears. He handed them to prisoners and farmhands alike, no distinction made. "Good work," he said simply. They drank in silence, watching the sun set over fields nearly emptied of crop. The sky turned orange, then red, then purple. Somewhere a dog barked. A train whistle sounded in the distance, mournful and lonely. Otto raised his bottle. "To the harvest." William nodded. "To the harvest." And they drank together, enemies who had become something else. Not quite friends, not quite allies, but men who had worked side by side and found common ground in exhaustion and accomplishment. In late September, 2 prisoners from another camp tried to escape. They made it 40 miles before being caught hiding in a barn outside Des Moines. The news rippled through the POW camps like electricity. Guards became more vigilant. Trust eroded. At the Hartman farm, tension appeared overnight. William watched the prisoners more carefully. Margaret stopped leaving doors unlocked. The boys no longer played in the yard when the Germans were nearby. Hans felt it like a physical weight. They had built something fragile here, a temporary peace constructed from daily routine and shared labor. The escape attempt threatened to shatter it. One morning, William called the prisoners together before work. "I know you didn't have anything to do with those boys who ran," he said. "But people are scared. They're wondering if I'm a fool for trusting you." He paused, studying each face. "Are you planning to run?" The question hung in the air. Hans thought about freedom, about Germany, about a home that might not exist anymore, a family he hadn't seen in 2 years. He thought about the work they'd done here, the harvest they'd brought in, the strange new life they'd built in this enemy country. "No," he said, "we're not running." The others echoed him. Otto, Klaus, even young Friedrich, who was so homesick he cried at night when he thought no one could hear. William nodded slowly. "Then we keep working." And that was it. No dramatic speech, no promises extracted or loyalty oaths demanded. Just a farmer taking a man at his word because there was work to be done, and winter was coming. In early October, Hans received a letter from Germany. It had taken 4 months to arrive, passed through censors and military bureaucracy, handled by a dozen different people before finally landing in his hands. He opened it in the barn loft, alone, hands shaking slightly. His mother's handwriting, familiar and perfect, made him close his eyes. For a moment he was 7 years old again, watching her write shopping lists at the kitchen table. The letter was brief. The censors had redacted large sections, leaving black lines where words had been. But the essential news came through clearly enough. The family home had been destroyed in an air raid. His father was helping with civil defense. His sister had been evacuated east. They were alive, but the Munich he remembered no longer existed. Hans read the letter 3 times, trying to find hope between the lines, but there was only survival. Bare, grinding survival with no end in sight. That evening, he sat on the porch steps of the farmhouse, letter still in his hand. Margaret found him there as the sun was setting. "Bad news?" she asked gently. He nodded, not trusting his voice. She sat beside him, not touching, but present. They watched the sky turn colors, the Iowa sunset painting clouds in shades no painter could reproduce. "My home is gone," he said finally. "Everything I knew." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Home isn't always a place," she said eventually. "Sometimes it's people, memories, things you carry inside." Hans looked at her. In the fading light, her face reminded him of his mother's. Same lines around the eyes, same quiet strength. "I don't know where I belong anymore," he admitted. "Maybe that's okay," Margaret said. "Maybe we're all just figuring that out." As autumn deepened, the war continued its relentless progression. The radio brought news of Allied advances in Europe, of Soviet pushes from the east, of islands taken and retaken in the Pacific. The prisoners listened to these reports with complicated feelings. Each Allied victory brought the war's end closer, but meant more German defeats, more destroyed cities, more casualties. In the farmhouse kitchen, they heard reports about the Battle of Aachen, the first German city to fall to the Allies. Hans had never been there, but knowing that American soldiers were now fighting in German streets made the war suddenly intimate again. William noticed him staring at the radio, face tense. "Strange, isn't it?" the farmer said. "Being here while your country's being invaded." Hans nodded. Strange didn't begin to cover it. "My grandfather left Germany to avoid war," William continued. "He saw what was coming even then. Nationalism, empire building. He wanted no part of it." He poured coffee, the kitchen filling with its rich smell. "Funny thing is, his son's grandson ended up dying in Europe anyway. We cross an ocean to avoid something, and 3 generations later it finds us regardless." Hans accepted the coffee. "You think war is inevitable?" "I think men make choices," William said. "And those choices have consequences that ripple forward. Your leaders chose this. Mine did too, in their way, and now here we are, you in Iowa. My son in a grave in France." The bitterness in his voice was new, or maybe it had always been there, just hidden beneath the daily work. "I'm sorry," Hans said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. William looked at him for a long moment. "I know you are. That's why you're still here." In late November, Margaret insisted on including the prisoners in Thanksgiving dinner. William was reluctant, knowing it would cause talk in town, but his wife was immovable. "They've worked this farm as hard as anyone," she said. "They deserve a proper meal." So on Thanksgiving Day, they crowded around the extended dining table. The Hartman family, the 6 prisoners, and 2 neighboring farmers who had no one else to eat with. The table groaned with food. Turkey roasted golden, stuffing made from Margaret's grandmother's recipe, sweet potatoes, mashed potatoes, green beans cooked with bacon, cranberry sauce that caught the light like rubies, pies that would come later, each one a work of art. They said grace, William's voice low and earnest, thanking God for the harvest, for the food, for the hands that had brought it all in. Hans kept his eyes closed and thought about other Thanksgivings he'd heard about from American prisoners he'd guarded back in Africa. They had talked about this meal, this tradition, with a longing that bordered on religious fervor. Now he understood. The meal was chaotic. Platters passed hand to hand. Conversations overlapped. Peter told a joke that made Klaus snort milk through his nose. Thomas demonstrated how to make the perfect gravy boat. One of the neighboring farmers, a taciturn man named Schmidt, whose family was also originally from Germany, taught Otto a drinking song from the old country that Margaret pretended to disapprove of. For 3 hours, the war didn't exist. There was only food and laughter and the warmth of being together. Hans looked around the table and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not quite happiness, not quite belonging, but something close to both. Late that night, lying in the loft with a full stomach and exhaustion in his bones, Hans whispered to Otto in German, "Do you think about going back?" "Every day," Otto replied, "and also never." Hans understood. Germany was home, but Iowa had become something too. A place where he was useful, where people knew his name, where he wasn't judged by his uniform, but by the straightness of his rows. "When this is over," he said, "I don't know what I'll be." "None of us do," Otto said, "but at least we'll be alive." Winter arrived suddenly and completely. Snow fell for 3 days straight, transforming the landscape into something alien and beautiful. The fields disappeared beneath white. The farmhouse became an island in a frozen sea. Ice built up on the barn roof, forming icicles that hung like daggers. The work shifted. Animals needed tending, equipment needed repairing, wood needed chopping. The prisoners adapted, layering clothing donated by neighboring farms, working in shorter shifts to avoid frostbite. Hans had never experienced cold like Iowa cold. In Germany, winter was harsh, but this was something else. Wind that cut through layers of wool. Cold that made your lungs hurt. Nights where the thermometer dropped so low that water left in the barn froze solid. But there was beauty too. Mornings when the sun rose over pristine snow, turning the world gold and pink. Evenings when smoke rose straight up from farmhouse chimneys, the air too still and cold to move it. Nights when stars seemed close enough to touch, the sky so clear and dark that the Milky Way painted a river of light across the heavens. On Christmas Eve, Margaret asked the prisoners if they wanted to help decorate. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. They strung popcorn and cranberries. They helped bring the tree inside, a cedar that William had cut from the back 40. They hung ornaments, each one carrying a story Margaret told while Peter and Thomas listened with only partial attention. Klaus, the youngest, hung a glass angel near the top. His hand shook slightly. Hans knew he was thinking about home, about other Christmases, about a world that seemed impossibly distant. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, standing back to admire their work. And it was. Imperfect and homemade and full of love. Christmas morning arrived cold and clear. William woke the prisoners before dawn as usual, but instead of heading to the barn, he gestured toward the house. "Breakfast first today," he said. The kitchen smelled like heaven, cinnamon and bacon and fresh bread. Margaret had been cooking since before sunrise, and the table held more food than seemed possible. They ate together, passing dishes and laughing at Peter's story about the Christmas his brother dressed up as Santa and got stuck in the chimney. The mention of James didn't bring sadness this time, just fondness, memory without the sharp edge of fresh grief. After breakfast, Margaret brought out packages wrapped in brown paper, simple gifts, socks, gloves, a knife for Otto, who had been borrowing tools all season, a harmonica for Klaus, who had mentioned once that he used to play. Hans received a notebook and pencil. Margaret handed it to him with a knowing look. "I've seen you trying to write on scraps," she said. "Figured you could use something proper." He opened it there at the table, the blank pages full of possibility. That night he would begin writing. Not a diary exactly. Not letters that would never be sent, but something. A record of this strange year, this impossible time, these people who had become real to him. The new year brought news that changed everything. The Germans had launched a massive counteroffensive in the Ardennes, catching the Allies by surprise. The Battle of the Bulge, the radio called it. The bloodiest battle Americans had faced in Europe. The prisoners listened to the reports with growing horror. Their army, their country, launching one last desperate gamble. And failing. The reports grew darker each day. German supply lines collapsing. The offensive stalling in the snow and mud. Soldiers dying by the thousands. Hans felt split in half. Part of him still identified with those soldiers, still felt the pull of homeland and duty. But another part, newer and more fragile, had shifted. He had worked this farm. He had eaten at this table. He had celebrated Christmas with these people. And the thought of American soldiers dying in Belgian snow made him feel sick. One evening, William found him in the barn, ostensibly checking equipment, but really just standing in the dark, lost. "You doing okay?" the farmer asked. Hans didn't know how to answer. How do you explain being at war with yourself, having your identity fracture into pieces that no longer fit together? "I don't know who I am anymore," he said finally. William leaned against a support post, considering this. "Maybe you're just becoming who you were always supposed to be," he said, "before the war decided for you." "And who is that?" "I don't know," William admitted. "But I know you're a man who does good work, who keeps his word, who's kind to my boys. That seems like a decent start." Hans thought about this, about identity and nationality and the labels people wore like armor, about the possibility of being something simple, just a man, just a person trying to do right in a world that made right complicated. "Thank you," he said. William nodded and walked back to the house, leaving Hans alone with his thoughts and the quiet sounds of animals settling for the night. February brought the first hints of thaw. Snow began to melt, creating rivers of mud. The ground, frozen solid for months, started to soften. Birds returned, tentative scouts checking if winter had truly released its grip. One afternoon, Hans and Peter were mending fence in the back 40. The work was simple but necessary, replacing posts that had rotted through, tightening wire that had gone slack. Peter had grown over the winter, not in height, though he'd gained a couple inches, but in maturity. He spoke less like a boy and more like a young man learning who he wanted to become. "You going back?" Peter asked. "When the war's over?" Hans had thought about this question constantly. It haunted his dreams and colored his waking hours. "I don't know," he said honestly. "There's nothing left of my home. My city is rubble. My family is scattered." "You could stay here," Peter said. He didn't look at Hans, focusing on the fence post he was positioning. "Iowa could use good farmers." The statement was simple, naive even. Immigration law, citizenship requirements, the complicated bureaucracy of peacetime. Peter didn't understand any of that, but the sentiment behind it made Hans's throat tight. "Maybe," he said softly. They worked in silence, the only sounds their breathing and the squeak of wire being pulled tight. Overhead, a formation of geese flew north, calling to each other in voices that sounded like hope. As winter finally broke, the cycle began again. Fields needed preparing, equipment needed servicing, seeds needed ordering. William sat at the kitchen table with papers spread before him, planning the season ahead. He called Hans over one evening. "Thinking about rotating crops," William said, pointing at a hand-drawn map of his land. "Corn here for 3 years. Time to give the soil a rest. Was thinking soybeans." He looked up at Hans. "You ever grow soybeans?" "A little. My father tried them once." "What do you think?" William asked. And that question, simple as it was, carried weight. He wasn't ordering, he was asking, treating Hans not as a prisoner or a laborer, but as someone whose opinion mattered. Hans studied the map, thinking about soil composition and rainfall patterns, and the peculiarities of Iowa weather. "Here," he said, pointing to the North 40, "this field, soil drains well, and soybeans fix nitrogen, good for next year's corn." William nodded slowly. "That's what I was thinking too." They planned the season together, two farmers preparing for the work ahead. And if you had walked into that kitchen not knowing their history, you would have seen nothing unusual. Just men doing what farmers have always done, looking forward, planning, hoping. In mid-April, the news finally came that everyone had been waiting for and dreading. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Berlin was surrounded. The Nazi government was collapsing. The prisoners gathered around the radio in the barn, listening to reports in stunned silence. Their country was falling. Cities were being occupied. The army was disintegrating. Everything they had fought for was ending, not with glory, but with catastrophic defeat. Klaus cried openly. Otto sat with his head in his hands. Hans felt numb, like his body had stopped processing emotions entirely. That evening, William came to the barn. He didn't say anything, just sat on a hay bale near Hans, both of them staring at the wall. "My father told me about the last war," William finally said. "How Germany was crushed, how the peace was designed to humiliate, how that humiliation festered and grew into this." He paused, searching for words. "I hope we do better this time. I hope we learn that you can't build peace on shame." Hans looked at him. "What happens to us now?" "I don't know," William admitted. "But whatever happens, you'll have worked a year on this farm. That's got to count for something." The day arrived on a Tuesday. The town of Algona celebrated with all the joy of a people who had carried fear for too long. Flags appeared on every house. Church bells rang. People hugged in the streets. The prisoners remained at the camp, confined while the town celebrated around them. Hans sat in the barracks, listening to distant cheering, feeling like he existed outside time and space. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. But he was here, alive, in Iowa, and Germany felt like a fever dream he'd had once. William came to the camp that evening. He found Hans alone in the yard, watching the sun set over the fence. Thought you might want company, the farmer said. They stood together in silence, watching light drain from the sky. I don't know what happens now, Hans said. To any of us. None of us do, William replied. War's over, but figuring out what comes next? That might take longer than the fighting did. Will you need help with planting? Hans asked. William smiled, small and sad. I'd welcome it. The summer unfolded with strange normalcy. The prisoners continued working the farms. The corn grew. The cycle repeated itself. But everything was different now. The war in Europe had ended. Germany was occupied. Prisoners knew they would eventually be sent home, but no one knew when or what they would find when they got there. Hans worked the Hartmann farm through June and July, putting in the same hard hours, eating at the same table. But there was a provisional quality to everything now, like they were all waiting for a shoe to drop. In August, Japan surrendered. The entire war was over. The world was at peace, if peace was the right word for the exhausted silence that follows catastrophic violence. Soldiers would be coming home. Not James, never James, but thousands of others. And the prisoners would need to leave, to make room, to go back to whatever remained of their lives. In early September, William received notice. The prisoners would be transferred back to Camp Algona, then prepared for repatriation to Germany. The time frame was vague, weeks, maybe months, but the end was coming. That evening, the family and the prisoners gathered one last time around the dinner table. Margaret had made roast chicken, the meal they'd shared that first week a year ago. The circular nature of it wasn't lost on anyone. I want to thank you, William said, standing with his glass raised. You worked this farm like it was your own. You helped bring in 2 harvests. You became part of this place. He paused, voice thick. My son died fighting your army. That's a fact I carry every day. But knowing you, working alongside you, it doesn't erase that pain. But it complicates it in ways that matter. Hans stood as well, searching for English words adequate to the moment. You showed us who we could be, he said. Not soldiers, not prisoners, just men. That is a gift I will carry forever. They drank together, then ate in the easy silence of people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. After dinner, Peter pulled Hans aside. The boy was 15 now, nearly a man, working the farm alongside his father with increasing skill. Will you write? Peter asked. If I can, Hans promised. Mail between Germany and America might be complicated for a while. But you'll try. I'll try. Peter nodded, satisfied. Then, impulsively, he hugged Hans. A quick, fierce embrace that surprised them both. Thank you for talking to me, Peter said. About James, about grief. Nobody else would. Hans felt tears prick his eyes. Thank you for listening. The day came on a cold October morning. A truck arrived to take the prisoners back to Camp Algona. Hans and the others packed their few possessions. The harmonica Klaus had been given. The knife Otto had used to repair countless pieces of equipment. Hans's notebook, now filled with writing in German and English mixed together, neither language quite adequate on its own. The Hartmann family stood in the farmyard. Margaret pressed packages of food into each man's hands. Sandwiches for the journey, cookies wrapped in cloth. Peter stood close to his father, trying not to cry. William shook each prisoner's hand, a formal gesture that carried weight. When he reached Hans, he held the handshake a moment longer. You're a good man, William said. Don't let anyone tell you different. So are you, Hans replied. The truck engine rumbled. Time had run out. The prisoners climbed into the back, sitting on wooden benches, looking out at the farm that had become familiar. The fields they'd planted and harvested. The barn where they'd slept and talked and dreamed. The house where they'd eaten meals and celebrated holidays and slowly become human again. As the truck pulled away, Hans watched the family grow smaller. William with his arm around Margaret, Peter and Thomas waving, the dog barking and running alongside the truck until it couldn't keep up. The farm disappeared around a bend in the road. Iowa rolled past, golden in the autumn light. And Hans sat with his notebook in his lap, knowing that no matter what came next, This year had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Most German POWs were repatriated in 1946 and 1947. They returned to a Germany divided by the victors, cities destroyed, families scattered. Many found that the home they remembered no longer existed. The relationships formed between prisoners and American families proved surprisingly durable. Some prisoners corresponded with their host families for decades. A few managed to immigrate back to America legally, settling in the communities where they had once been held captive. Hans Müller returned to Munich in the spring of 1946. His mother had survived, living in a single room of what remained of their family home. His sister was in the Soviet zone, unreachable. His father had died of pneumonia in the final winter of the war. He found work helping rebuild the city, one brick at a time. The work was different from farming but carried some of the same satisfaction. Taking something broken and making it whole again, creating order from chaos. In 1948, he received a letter from Iowa. William Hartman wrote about the harvest, about Peter, who was now helping run the farm full-time, about how they thought of Hans sometimes when the corn grew tall. The letter was simple, factual, friendly. Hans wrote back, and then he wrote again, and the correspondence continued, irregular but consistent. Two men on opposite sides of the world maintaining a connection forged in work and unexpected grace. In 1952, Hans immigrated to the United States. The process took years, complicated by his status as a former enemy soldier. But persistence and good references, including a detailed letter from William Hartman, eventually won out. He didn't return to Iowa immediately. He worked in Chicago first, learning English more fluently, earning money, establishing himself. But in 1955, he visited the Hartman farm, stood in the yard where he'd worked as a prisoner, walked between rows of corn that reached toward an Iowa sky. "Looks good," he told William. "Come spring, I could use help with planting," William said. It wasn't quite an offer. It wasn't quite a question. But Hans understood. "I'd like that," he said. He bought a small farm 20 miles away, married a German immigrant he met at a church social, had children who grew up knowing that their father had once been a prisoner of war, but had found something in captivity that made him free. Peter Hartman eventually inherited his family's farm. He told his own children stories about the year German soldiers worked their land, about how enemy and friend were sometimes just choices people made, about how grace could exist even in war. The last recorded correspondence between Hans and William was in 1978. William was 87, still living on the farm, but no longer working it. Hans was 61, running his own operation with help from his son. William's letter was brief. His handwriting had grown shaky. "Thinking about that year," he wrote, "how strange it was that you ended up here. But I'm glad you did. You helped me understand something important, that the enemy is just people who got caught up in something bigger than themselves. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you get to see them become people again." Hans kept that letter until he died in 1989. It was found among his papers, along with the notebook he'd filled during his time as a prisoner. His children donated both to the Iowa Historical Society. The Hartman farm is still operating, now run by William's great-grandchildren. The barn where prisoners slept has been renovated but still stands. Every year, for the town's autumn festival, the family tells the story about war and work and the strange ways people find common ground. And sometimes when the corn grows tall and the Iowa wind moves through it like water, you can almost hear it. The echo of men who were enemies learning to be neighbors. The sound of old wounds starting to heal. The quiet revolution of grace extended and accepted. The war ended. But the peace took longer. It was built one farm at a time, one meal at a time, one honest day's work after another. Not dramatic, not simple, but real. And maybe that's all peace ever is. People choosing day after day to see humanity in each other, even when history says they shouldn't, even when the world tells them they're enemies. Especially then.